Fidelity.
We welcome you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me start by recognizing the chief guest, who is the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Permit me also to recognize the family of the late Dr. Abubakar Olusola Saraki, and permit me for good order to stand on the protocols already established. Let me say how glad, honored, and privileged I am to be invited to deliver a memorial lecture on the 10th anniversary to commemorate the departure of Dr. Abubakar Olusola Saraki. Any keen student of African politics, and I claim to be such a keen student, would have heard of Dr. Saraki, and I had heard of him before this invitation. I had also had the honor and privilege of meeting Dr. Bukola Saraki when he was the President of the Senate. And he granted me the opportunity to address the Senate then. That is not to forget that my good friend, Brother Bajamila, also granted me a similar occasion in the House of Representatives. I'm glad to deliver a lecture to memorialize an individual of whom it can be said that he was a colossus who bestrode the Nigerian political terrain and made his contribution in a manner that makes it worthy to be remembered favorably. I say so because there is no shortage of individuals who come and go and their memories are not worth much. We have had the honor and privilege of seeing the snippets of what he did during his lifetime. And if it is true that one is not successful until his successor succeeds, then Dr. Saraki was successful. He was successful because his successors have succeeded and they continue to succeed. If it is true that men and women's deed are recognized for their positive contribution to society, then it is true that Dr. Saraki was a man worthy of celebration. I'm glad to be in your distinguished presence to deliver a lecture in his memory and to have that lecture focus on the critical question of leadership in Africa and the critical question of followership in Africa. And the Africa that I talk about is the post-colonial Africa. The Africa which is now divided into 55 countries with 55 boundaries imposed on her. An Africa which is famous as the cradle of mankind. An Africa which is said to be great in prospect. An Africa about which there is much expectation, but an Africa which continues to punch below her weight. That is the Africa that I will be talking about as I focus on the question of leadership and followership. As I think about that Africa and her leadership and followership, and I think about her often, as all of us should, The words of a book that I read as a youngster come to mind. And any one of us who had the opportunity of reading the book A Tale of Two Cities will remember these words. It was the time, the best of times and the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief and the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light and the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope and the winter of despair. Those words define the mother continent as we live in her today. Those who commentate about the continent never tire to say that this is a great continent. Those who care about this continent never tire to remember that this continent, divided as she is, has had many leaders. And when I allow my mind to go down memory lane, I can remember so very vividly the immortal words of many great African leaders on the eve of our regaining our independence. And many of us can see pictures of young Africans, whether in Nigeria or Ghana or Algeria or Kenya or Tanzania, celebrating when we regained our independence. And many of us can remember the words that they spoke and the promises that they made. If it was in Nigeria here, you can remember the immortal words about what they would do to Nigeria of Nnamdi Azikiwe. You can remember those words. You can remember the words of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. You can remember the promises he made. You can remember the erudite words of the Sultan of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, and the promises he made, and many others. When they spoke then, those who are young saw in them the similitude of Moses in the Bible. They thought of their leaders and saw their leaders as messiahs who would bedazzle latter-day pharaohs with miracles, who would liberate them from the Egypt of poverty and want, who would cause pillars of fire to stand between them and sorrow and want, who would part the Red Seas of tribalism and ethnicity, who in times of hunger would summon manna and quail from heaven. That is what they thought of their leaders, messiahs. But today, permit me to say, in many African countries, they are saying, it was better while we waited. It was better while we waited. There is a sense in which throughout the continent of Africa, there has been disappointment with leaders at all levels. So that when on the eve of independence, We wanted to come home. Now that we regained independence, we never tire to see images of our young men and women dying in the Sahara, dying in the Mediterranean Sea, being humiliated at the embassies of the erstwhile colonizers as they seek to leave our countries and the continent. It was better while we waited, they say. Which begs the question, what happened and what is happening? That we have so many individuals who occupy positions of leadership, and yet the biggest deficit is that of leadership in Africa. You know, in 1983, your own countryman, the late Chinua Achebe, wrote a little book which he could well have been writing about Africa, but he focused on Nigeria, the trouble with Nigeria. And Chinua, without mincing words, says the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. Whether you agree or disagree with Chinua, that is another debate. But he had his perspective. And he was asking a question that we continue to ask about the continent of Africa. Why is it that while on average 60 years after we regained independence, the 55 countries that constitute the continent of Africa, why is it that we cannot feed ourselves? Why is it that we have no faith in our institutions? We have no faith in our hospitals. Why is it that we have no faith in our abilities? Why is it? Where has the leadership been? Why is it that so many years, while politics becomes the toy that lulls us into a false sense of security, our economies are controlled by people from other civilizations? Why is it? These are uncomfortable questions which we must pose and confront and answer if the mother continent is to realize our potential. Why is it that the mother continent is ever so negatively attractive to other civilizations? You know, as I talk about leadership, and as I think about leadership, and I think about what leaders are enjoined to do, I think about this mother continent. And many times, I see how our men and women in positions of leadership are being treated by other civilizations. And I said, oh God, where are our leaders? When the world congregates under the G7, there are no African leaders there. The best they can do is to invite one or two. And beyond the photo opportunity, they are told to go away, and go away they do. When there is a meeting of the G20, it is the same thing. There is no African leader there. And when at the United Nations they have voted all our countries, France, the United States, China, Russia, can come and neutralize all our votes. And I say, where are the leaders in Africa? And as you observe African leadership today, they are summoned by different leaders in the world. If the Japanese do not summon them to Tokyo under UNCTAD, the Indians are summoning them to New Delhi. And if the Indians are not summoning them, the Turks are summoning them. And if the Turks are not summoning them, the Chinese are summoning them. In the next 2 weeks, they will have been summoned to the United States of America. Summoned, I use. Africans who are watching this scenario ask, where are our leaders? Which begs the question, who is a leader? Is leadership the occupation of office? Is leadership the occupation of the office of the president? Is it the occupation of the office of a senator or a member of parliament? Or the occupation of these high-sounding positions which gives us honorifics? Is that what leadership is? From where I sit, that is pseudo-leadership. From where I sit, leadership is about service. Leadership is about honor and privilege to serve. That is why I still understand the men of old, the men of wisdom who said, he who is greatest amongst you must be your servant. This is what Africa is asking for. And Africa has been asking this question since she regained her independence. You know, when one is talking about leadership in Africa, one must go into history and ask ourselves, what was leadership before we were rudely disrupted? We had our traditional rulers. How did they govern? For whose benefit did they govern? They are still there, the traditional rulers. How do they fit in the new dispensation? When we regained independence and adopted all these structures from the erstwhile colonizer, what did we expect to deliver? That great American Pan-Africanist John Hendricks Clark says that when Africans regained their independence, not a single one of them re-examined the style of leadership. All of them continued with a mimicry of the leadership that they inherited from the colonizer. And he then delivers this verdict. Not a single African country will ever succeed by mimicry. And I want to submit to you that whether one agrees or disagrees with John Henry Clark, one must look at Africa in order to ask ourselves, what is the state of leadership in Africa? And permit me to run you across the continent of Africa, and you will see a continent that is not at ease. The continent is not at ease because the continent is suffering from a deficit of leadership. Look at Africa today. Tell me whether we are at ease in Niger. Tell me whether Mali is settled. Tell me whether there is quiet and calm in Chad. Tell me whether Guinea-Bissau is doing well. Tell me whether the Cameroons are stable. Tell me whether Central African Republic is good. Tell me whether Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Northern Mozambique, and all these countries where there is peace and quiet, whether the sons and daughters of this country, tell me whether even this great Nigeria is at ease. Tell me. The answer is, she is not. And I dare say that as long as Nigeria is not at ease, Africa will never be at ease. If Africa wants to be at ease, Nigeria must be at ease. She is the largest economy in Africa. She has a population of over nearly 200 million people. One in every African is a Nigerian. She is represented in every sector. If you want the best engineers in the continent, they are Nigerians. If you want the best doctors, they are Nigerians. If you want good lawyers, they are Nigerians. If you want good people, they are Nigerians. But also, if you want Yahoo boys, they are Nigerians. Nigeria is a great country. A friend of mine once told me that if you go to any part of the world and you do not find a Nigeria, leave that place, because there is nothing to do there. Nigerians are present everywhere in the world, everywhere in Africa, and Nigeria, I'm told, is a $500 billion economy. Never, ever be proud of that, Nigerians. This is an economy that should at least be a $4 trillion GDP economy. Whenever you reach that level, then I'll say Nigeria is doing the right thing. All the ingredients are there. The question is, why is it that she is not realizing our potential? When we talk about leadership, we must ask ourselves, why is it that despite the best intention of the best of us, we do not gain what we desire? You know, I said that when you look at Africa and leadership, you must go back to history. And you ask yourself what the leadership is. And we have looked at Africa that is not at ease. But yet there is a sense in which Africa has had and continues to have men and women of renown. I remember, courtesy of history, when Africa was struggling for our independence. I can remember that great meeting in Manchester in the United States of America, the Pan-African meeting. And history tells me that Nigeria was there. Chief Obafemi Awolowo was there in 1945. And I can still remember his words spoken about African unity. I remember that Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah was there. And then we remember how they came back to the continent to lead the continent. And I am still wondering how in those days, without the benefit of the internet, without the benefit of all means of communication that we now have today, that those men and women were able to govern and to galvanize the attention of the continent of Africa for the sake of Africa. They were there throughout. But even prior to that, I can still remember another great African talking about leading Africa out of our state, the great South African Pixley Kaisa Kaseme in 1906 in Columbia in the United States of America, saying Africa must be regenerated. When all these things happened, there were leaders in Africa at that time, and their mandate was cut out for them. Their mandate was to ensure that we broke the colonial chains, and we did. I remember, and many of you here, courtesy of history, will remember many Africans at that time, and if I name them, you will agree with me that they were leaders. How many of you in this assembly will not remember Marcus Garvey and say that he was a leader? How many of you here will not remember Julius Nyerere and not say that he was a leader? How many of you will remember Kaunda, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Moises Machel, Agostino Neto, Namdi Azikiwe, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and many others, and remember that they were leaders who did not want to occupy political space because of material aggrandizement. They denied themselves. I so very fondly remember that when Kenneth David Kaunda left office, it was said of him that the only amount of money he had in his account was the equivalent of $5,000. That is what your current politician eats for breakfast. I can remember when Julius Kambarage Nyerere left office after 24 years, the only amount of money that he had in his account was the equivalent of 8,000 United States dollars. That is what your current politician uses for a single visit to a gymnasium. They were leaders who were selfless. They understood that it was an honor and privilege. They sacrificed their lives. They saw their positions of leadership as that of leading their brethren. They did not think that they were superior to the people they led. They thought it was a privilege and that they had the honor, and that because they had that honor, then they had to serve their leaders with distinction, with consistency. They were prepared to be questioned. They did not believe that they had the monopoly of knowledge and wisdom. They were leaders because they were servants. You know, I can still remember Julius Kambarage Nyerere speaking on the 6th day of March, 1997 in Accra, Ghana, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the independence of Ghana, under the subject, "Without unity, Africa has no future." Mwalimu recounts the history of Africa. He says, when we rose up against the colonialists, our agenda was cut out for us. We, the Africans, had been humiliated in our own lands. Our people had been denied the opportunity to realize their potential. Our mandate was one, to expel the colonizer. We did our bit. We made our mistakes. But who said we were infallible? This struggle is an intergenerational struggle. The next generation after us had the duty to pick up the baton and to run the next leg. The question is, did that generation pick up the baton? Have they run the leg well? The answer, not as well as they should have. Because we must never make the mistake of assuming that African leaders have done nothing. No, that would be too harsh. I think attempts have been made, whether in Nigeria or in different parts of Africa, to liberate ourselves from the chains and sorrows of the colonial project. But remember, as Kwame once said, the colonialists never left. He is alive and well. He still wears different masks. And those masks may appear to camouflage him, but they are here. Have you ever wondered why, when the British left their colonies, they created something that they called the Commonwealth of Nations, to which Nigeria belongs? In that Commonwealth of Nations, the head is the British monarch. When the Queen dies, the King becomes its head. It is headquartered in London. It is the Commonwealth of Independent and Free Nations. It is not. It is a post-colonial, neocolonial institution which continues to massage the ego of the erstwhile colonizer as we celebrate. Through such institutions, they continue to control and to manipulate us. And many of us, particularly those of us who have had the advantage of foreign education, we never want to talk ill of bodies such as the Commonwealth. I do.